In a small town cemetery, a loyal German shepherd named Titan has stood guard for 7 years over a weathered grave. But why? What is he waiting for? This is the story of a promise that transcends time, love that endures beyond death, and a bond between man and dog that defies all odds. Join me as we uncover the mystery of Titan and the unforgettable legacy of loyalty that will tug at your heart. The rain came down in relentless sheets, drumming against the cracked earth of Willow Creek's forgotten cemetery. Each drop seemed to carry a weight of its own, soaking the brittle grass and pooling in the hollows of ancient headstones. Amid this desolate scene stood a figure that didn't belong, a German shepherd, his black and tan coat slick with water, his amber eyes fixed on a single weathered grave. For 7 long years, through scorching summers, bone-chilling winters, and storms that uprooted trees, he had not moved from that spot. The townsfolk called him Titan, a name born of whispers and speculation, but no one knew where he'd come from or why he stayed. Day after day, he sat there, a silent sentinel guarding a secret no one could unravel. If anyone approached too close, he'd let out a low growl, not menacing, but firm, a warning etched in instinct, "Stay back. This is my duty." James Hartley, a retired historian of 62, stood beneath a sagging black umbrella, his gray eyes tracing the dog's unwavering form. He'd heard the tales of Titan over cups of lukewarm coffee at the local diner, stories of a dog who refused food unless left alone, who ignored coaxing leashes and warm beds, who seemed tethered to that grave by an invisible chain. But seeing it now, in the flesh, sent a shiver down James's spine that had nothing to do with the December chill. Those eyes, sharp, resolute, ancient, held a depth that defied explanation. James adjusted his scarf, his breath fogging in the air. A dog doesn't wait 7 years for nothing, he thought. There's a story here, buried as deep as the bones beneath that stone. Little did he know, that rainy afternoon would mark the beginning of a journey, one that would unearth a legacy stretching back to World War II, and prove that loyalty could defy even the grave itself. Part 1, The Man and the Mystery. James wasn't the type to meddle. For decades of teaching history had taught him patience, let the past reveal itself in its own time, through dusty letters and faded photographs. But Titan wasn't a textbook or a crumbling archive. Titan was alive, breathing, a living enigma that gnawed at James's curiosity like a splinter under the skin. He'd moved to Willow Creek 3 years ago, after retiring from the university, seeking a quiet life of books and solitude. His days were simple, morning walks along the creek, afternoons with a novel by the fireplace, evenings sipping tea while the radio hummed old jazz tunes. Yet here he was, standing in a cemetery under a leaking umbrella, unable to tear himself away from a dog that seemed to carry the weight of centuries in its gaze. That first day, he kept his distance. He found a splintered bench about 20 yards from the grave, unfolded a newspaper he had no intention of reading, and watched. Titan didn't flinch. The rain plastered his fur to his lean frame, but he sat as still as the headstones around him, ears erect, eyes locked on the grave. Hours passed. The rain slowed to a drizzle, then stopped, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. A pickup truck rumbled by on the nearby road, its driver glancing curiously at the scene before disappearing into the mist. Titan didn't even blink. James folded his paper, muttering to himself, "What are you waiting for, old boy?" The next morning, he returned. This time, he brought a thermos of coffee, a turkey sandwich wrapped in foil, and a small notebook. The sky was clear now, a brittle blue that made the cemetery feel even more desolate. Titan was there, as expected, his posture unchanged. James approached cautiously, stopping a few feet from the grave. Titan's head lifted slightly, his eyes meeting James's with an intensity that made the older man pause. "I'm not here to bother you," James said softly, raising a hand in peace. He set the sandwich on the ground, stepped back, and waited. Titan stared at the offering, then returned his gaze to the grave, unmoved. James sighed, opened his notebook, and scribbled, "Day 2, Titan refuses food. Purpose unclear." Grave number 47, Edward H. Grayson, 1918–1944. Grave number 47 was unremarkable at first glance. The headstone was chipped and moss-covered, the inscription barely legible under decades of neglect. Edward H. Grayson, 1918–1944, it read, with no epitaph, no dates of service, no hint of who he'd been. James traced the letters with his finger, frowning. A soldier, most likely, killed in World War II at the age of 26. But why Titan? Why this grave? He sat back on the bench, sipping his coffee, the question looping in his mind like a broken record. That afternoon, he stopped by the diner, a cozy spot called Martha's Place, where the locals gathered to swap gossip over pie and gravy. Martha, a wiry woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, slid a mug of coffee across the counter. "Saw you out there with that dog," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're not the first to get curious, you know." James took a sip, the warmth seeping into his chilled bones. "What's the story, Martha?" 7 years is a long time for a dog to sit in one place. She leaned against the counter, her gaze drifting out the window toward the cemetery. "No one knows for sure. Some say he was dumped here by a trucker who didn't want him. Others reckon his owner's under that stone. Me? I think he's waiting for something, or someone. I used to leave scraps for him, back when he first showed up. He'd eat, but only after I'd gone. Never seen a dog so dedicated." Dedicated, James repeated, the word sticking with him. "To what, though?" Martha shrugged. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? All I know is, he's been out there through blizzards, heat waves, you name it. Never barks, never fights. Just sits. Like he's keeping a promise." Her words haunted James that night. He lay awake in his small cabin, the wind rattling the windows, imagining Titan out there in the dark, alone but resolute. A promise. What kind of promise could bind a dog to a grave for 7 years? By morning, he'd made up his mind. He wasn't just going to watch anymore. He was going to dig, figuratively, at least. The historian in him demanded answers. First climax, the diary's revelation. The Willow Creek Library was a squat, brick building on the edge of town, its shelves sagging under the weight of decades-old books and yellowed newspapers. James spent the next week there, combing through records of local soldiers, cross-referencing names from World War II casualty lists. Edward H. Grayson's file was thin, a single page noting his enlistment in the 29th Infantry Division, his death at Normandy on June 8, 1944, and his burial in Willow Creek after the war. No surviving family was listed, no personal effects returned. A dead end, it seemed. But James wasn't ready to give up. On the 8th day, buried in the library's cluttered storage room, he found something that stopped his breath. Behind a row of moldy encyclopedias sat a wooden box, its lid warped with age. Inside was a small leather-bound diary, its pages brittle but intact. The first page bore a shaky inscription, Edward H. Grayson, 1943, for Rex. James's hands trembled as he opened it, the historian's thrill mixing with a strange sense of dread. The entries were short, written in a soldier's hasty scrawl. March 12, 1943, Rex saved my hide today. Sniffed out a mine just before I stepped on it. Owe him my life. James flipped ahead, his pulse quickening. July 19, 1943, Rex is more than a K9. He's my brother. Sleeps by my cot every night, watches my back. Promised him I'd take him home if we make it. The words painted a picture of a bond forged in the chaos of war, a young soldier and his German shepherd, inseparable amid the mud and blood of Europe. The final entry, dated June 5, 1944, just before D-Day, hit James like a punch to the gut. Tomorrow we hit the beaches. I know I won't come back. Rex is staying at base camp. I've written to Pa, told him to find Rex if I don't make it. I hope he gets home to Willow Creek. He deserves peace, not this hell. Goodbye, old boy. A folded letter was tucked into the back cover, addressed to Mr. Henry Grayson, Edward's father. It read, Pa, if I don't come home, find Rex. He's the best friend I ever had. Bring him to Willow Creek for me. James sat back, the diary heavy in his hands. Rex. Edward's dog. A German shepherd who'd survived the war, or at least, who'd been meant to. But how did Titan fit in? Was he a descendant, carrying on a legacy across generations? James closed the diary, his mind racing. He grabbed his coat and drove straight to the cemetery, the book clutched under his arm. Titan was there, as always, his fur dusted with frost from the morning chill. James knelt before the grave, ignoring the damp seeping through his trousers. You're connected to Rex, aren't you? He said, his voice hoarse. Edward wanted him here, and somehow, you're keeping that promise. Titan tilted his head, his amber eyes glinting in the weak sunlight. For a moment, James swore the dog understood. Part 2, The Search for a Legacy. The discovery lit a fire in James. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore, it was personal. Titan deserved more than a life of silent vigil beside a grave. If he was Rex's descendant, there had to be a family out there, someone tied to Edward Grayson who could give Titan the home Edward had dreamed of for Rex. James threw himself into the search with a vigor he hadn't felt since his teaching days. He pored over genealogical records, contacted military historians, and posted Titan's story on online forums, attaching a blurry photo he'd snapped with his phone. Meanwhile, he became a fixture at the cemetery. Each morning, he brought Titan food, bits of chicken, biscuits, whatever he could spare, and sat with him, talking as if the dog could reply. Edward was a brave man, he said one day, the wind tugging at his scarf. He loved Rex like you wouldn't believe. I think you're here for him, aren't you? Titan never answered, but one afternoon, after weeks of refusal, he took a piece of chicken from James's hand and ate it right there, his eyes never leaving the grave. James's heart swelled. It was a small victory, a crack in Titan's armor. The breakthrough came on a snowy evening in late December. James's inbox pinged with an email from a woman named Abigail Grayson, a 45-year-old schoolteacher from Akron, Ohio. I'm Edward Grayson's great-niece, she wrote. My grandfather, Henry Grayson, was Edward's brother. He used to tell me stories about Rex, the dog Edward left behind in the war. I saw your post about Titan, it's uncanny. He looks just like the Rex in Grandpa's old photo. Attached was a grainy black and white image, a German shepherd with the same proud stance, the same piercing eyes as Titan. James replied immediately, his fingers fumbling over the keys. Abigail, I think Titan is a descendant of Rex. He's been guarding Edward's grave for 7 years. Can you come to Willow Creek? Her response arrived within the hour, I'll be there in 3 days. I can't believe this is real. James spent those 3 days preparing. He cleaned his cabin, dug out old maps of Willow Creek from the 1940s, and reread Edward's diary, memorizing every word about Rex. He also watched Titan more closely, noting the subtle changes, the way the dog's ears perked at distant sounds, the faint wag of his tail when James spoke Edward's name. Hope flickered in James's chest, but so did doubt. What if Titan wouldn't leave? What if 7 years had rooted him to that grave as surely as the oak trees around it? Second climax, the meeting that changed everything. Abigail arrived on a crisp, clear morning, the sky a pale blue streaked with wispy clouds. She was a petite woman with brown hair streaked with gray, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and disbelief. James met her at the diner, handing her a cup of coffee as they talked. She pulled the old photo of Rex from her purse, her hands trembling. Grandpa said Rex disappeared after the war, she explained. The family assumed he'd died. But years later, there were always German shepherds around Willow Creek, strays, people called them. I think one of them must have been Rex's pup. James nodded, leading her to the cemetery. Titan's been here since I moved to town. 7 years, never leaving Edward's grave. I think he's the last of that line. When they reached grave number 47, Titan stood, his ears twitching as Abigail approached. She stopped a few feet away, clutching the photo. Titan, she said softly, her voice breaking. The dog stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, his nose sniffing the air. He reached Abigail, pressed his muzzle against her hand, and sat, staring up at her with those ancient eyes. Abigail sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. You're him, aren't you? You're Rex's blood. James watched, his throat tight. He knows you, he whispered. He senses the connection. Abigail ran her fingers through Titan's damp fur. Grandpa told me Edward made him promise to find Rex if he didn't come back. But Grandpa died before he could. Maybe Titan's been finishing what they started. They sat there for an hour, Abigail recounting family stories, how Edward had been the quiet one, how he'd loved dogs since he was a boy, how his letters home were always about Rex. Titan listened, his head resting on Abigail's lap, a peace settling over him that James hadn't seen before. When it was time to go, Abigail stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. Come with me, Titan, she said gently, patting her leg. Titan hesitated, glancing back at the grave. Then, with a final look at Edward's headstone, he followed her to the car. Conclusion, a legacy honored. 2 weeks later, Willow Creek held a small ceremony at the cemetery. James had insisted on it, a way to honor Titan, Edward, and Rex. The townsfolk gathered, bundled in coats and scarves, as James read from Edward's diary, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Rex deserves peace, Edward wrote. If I don't make it, bring him home. Titan did that for him, and more. Abigail stood beside Titan, who now wore a new collar with a tag engraved, Titan Grayson, Keeper of Promises. Martha brought a tray of cookies, her eyes misty. Never thought I'd see the day he'd leave, she said, scratching Titan's ears. The local paper ran a story about it, titled The Dog Who Waited, and James mailed a copy to Abigail with a note, he's where he belongs now. Abigail sent back photos of Titan in Ohio, sprawled by her fireplace, chasing a ball in her backyard, his eyes brighter than they'd ever been in Willow Creek. James framed one and hung it beside Edward's diary in his cabin. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he'd look at it and smile. You kept your promise, Titan, he'd say. And you taught us all what loyalty really means. For the people of Willow Creek, Titan became a legend, a reminder that some bonds outlast time, war, and even death. And for James, he was a gift, a final chapter in a historian's life, proving that the past isn't just a story to study. Sometimes, it's a living, breathing thing, waiting to be found. If this story touched you, share it with someone who believes in loyalty. And if you ever see a dog waiting by a grave, don't walk away. They might be guarding more than you know.